Hello, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, and welcome to our session, 1 year later, Reflections on the January 6th Insurrection. We have a great panel today to discuss it, and we'll talk at the beginning amongst ourselves, and then we'll have time for Q&A, so be sure to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. 1 year ago and a day, we witnessed the most extraordinary event, certainly of my lifetime, political event of my lifetime, a mob storming the United States Capitol, overwhelming police, breaking windows and doors, entering offices, calling for the death of the vice president, threatening other members of Congress, forcing them to scatter for their lives. Their intent was to stop the peaceful transfer of power, something we've never really seen in this country. And while it happened, the President of the United States, who had egged them on earlier that day, watched on television and did nothing to stop it. Indeed, at one point reportedly saying, they're fighting for me, and seeming to enjoy what was going on. I worked in the Capitol for two different members of Congress. I used to give tours of the Capitol, and it was just impossible for me to reconcile those pictures with my experience. It couldn't happen here, and yet it did. It was just extraordinary. Yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of the insurrection, and we saw wall-to-wall coverage of the events of January 6th. But what we saw was a really partisan interpretation of what happened. You could say yesterday Washington was a city of two tales. Yesterday, the Republicans stayed away from the Capitol, at least the elected officials, except of course for Liz Cheney and remarkably Dick Cheney, who was welcomed as a hero by the Democrats. So remarkable indeed. But many through Twitter and other things, parroted the increasingly popular notion on the right that the rioters were in fact peaceful, that they were somehow the victims, that they were actually heroes. Others on the right probably couldn't stomach that, but still said, as the Wall Street Journal editorial yesterday said, well, it wasn't that bad, and Democrats are really making too much of this. After all, democracy held. There was never really a danger that the vote would be more than delayed. The court spoke, et cetera, and that the institutions of democracy held. But certainly President Biden, speaking for many of the Democrats, most Democrats, told a very different story. One in which he really went after President Trump, probably for the first time in his administration, blaming him for spreading a web of lies, propagating the idea that the election was stolen, saying that his bruised ego wouldn't allow him to accept the will of the American people. He's certainly expressing what most Democrats have been saying for some time, that January 6th was without precedent in American history, a president seeking to overturn the results of an election, not just through the mob itself, but through a variety of other means that we've now learned about, and that American democracy remains at grave risk. Where are we today? That'll be a subject of our conversation, but just some facts. Today, more people believe that the lie that the election was stolen than on January 6th, now nearly 80% of Republicans. In the immediate aftermath of January 6th, many elected Republicans condemned what happened. McConnell, McCarthy, Graham, Rubio, and in the impeachment hearings, 10 members of the House voted to impeach. Today, pretty much all of them have come to heel or been purged from the party, excepting perhaps Liz Cheney. This is now Trump's party. Polarization by any measure has increased, and perhaps most disturbing, political violence looks to be increasingly acceptable to a significant fraction of Republicans. Something like 40% now say that it's maybe necessary to preserve democracy. A reasonable number of on the left as well, but it's certainly not symmetric. And a series of measures have been undertaken at the state level where Republicans have power in the name of combating voter fraud that didn't exist, which have the potential not only to shape who votes, but also to undermine those safeguards that in Georgia and Michigan and Arizona and Pennsylvania prevailed in the last election. Political scientists who study democracies around the world have now downgraded the United States from in terms of our whether or not we are even a democracy. And others have warned that we are in peril of a civil war, actual conversations about the prospects of a civil war. Today, we'll be discussing these issues with a remarkable panel of colleagues from across the DU campus to assess why January 6th happened, but also to say where we are a year on. Joining me in moderating the panel today is my colleague Nazneen Barma. Naz, who is the director of the Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School and an associate professor at the Korbel School. Naz is a political scientist who works on a variety of topics spanning peace building, political order, and economic development around the world. And Naz, thank you so much for not only co-moderating, but really convening us and organizing today's panel. And let me toss it to you to introduce the rest of our remarkable panel.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Great to be here with you and all of our colleagues. And just before I introduce the rest of this terrific panel, I wanted to just amplify one thing that you said, which is to talk about why we used the word insurrection in the title of this event. We did it intentionally because I think we all believe, at least those of us on the screen, that what happened on January 6th last year at the US Capitol was a violent and armed attack against the institutions and functions of our democracy, an attack against the representatives we elected to serve us, against the public servants doing their jobs to keep the business of government going. And the goal of those who attacked and breached the Capitol was to overturn the results of a legitimate, free and fair democratic election in favor of reinstalling the person who lost that election. And I think in the year that has passed, the more we've learned about the efforts of Donald Trump's inner circle to overturn the results of the election, the more insurrection continues to be the accurate label for what happened on January 6th. So with that, let me introduce our wonderful colleagues who we have here with us today. Deborah Avant is director of the C. Chow Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy and a distinguished university professor at the Korbel School. She's an international relations scholar whose work focuses on civil-military relations and the role of non-state actors in controlling violence and generating governance. Alan Chen is the Thompson G. Marsh Law Alumni Professor at the Sturm College of Law. He's a leading national expert in free speech doctrine and theory, the law of federal courts, and public interest law. Rachel Epstein is Senior Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs and a professor at the Korbel School. She is a political scientist whose research focuses on international political economy, with particular expertise on the European Union, NATO, and post-communist transition in Eastern Europe. Seth Maskett is director of the Center on American Politics and professor of political science in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. He's an expert on American politics whose research focuses on American political parties, campaigns, and elections. Susan Schulten is professor of history in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. She is an expert on the American Civil War and Reconstruction, the history of American ideas and culture, and the American presidency. We're going to start with a round of questions directed to our panelists, as Fritz just said, for them to address in a few minutes each. And then with about 20-25 minutes left to go, we'll turn to a moderated Q&A with you, our audience. So for those of you on the webinar, please do submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will be tracking those to be sure that we answer as many of them as we can toward the end of our conversation. Back to you, Fritz.
Oh, it's great. So let's jump right in, and just a quick question for all of you. As I'd warned, the fundamental question is are we worse off today than we were a year ago on January 7, 2021, the day after the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol? And let me just ask you to respond very quickly, yes, no, and why? At least one thought, and I'll just go in order, alphabetical order, I guess, if we just introduce the panel. So let me start with Debbie.
Yeah, I think we're worse off. I spent the day last year thinking this is it. This is like a sobering turning point. And it seemed like it would be for a while. And I think it has been for many people, but I think for an increasing number of people, it has not. And for that reason, I feel like we're worse off.
Alan.
I'm going to say that we are better off, but barely. And the only reason I'm saying that is because President Biden is the president of the United States, and he was inaugurated the insurrection, not stop the count. Although the poll numbers are still bad, there are slightly smaller percentage of Republicans who believe that there was widespread fraud in the 2020 election than there was a year ago today. So just barely, I'll say we're better off.
Good. Glass half full. That's great. Rachel.
So I'm going to split it between Debbie and Alan and say
You can't do that.
we are better off narrowly, but worse off broadly in the following sense. I mean, there is this huge effort underway to prosecute the insurrectionists. And it's huge. It's the hugest such investigation of its kind in our history. And so at a low level, people are being held accountable. I think when I say broadly, we're worse off, is in the sense that higher level people, the people who actually incited the violence so far, legally and politically haven't been held accountable. And so on balance, thinking about what Debbie just said and thinking about also world opinion, because the Republican Party has held on to Trump and excised Liz Cheney from their ranks, from a world opinion point of view, there's nothing to say for the world or for the United States either that this couldn't happen again, that Trump won't be back and his insurrectionists won't be back.
Great. Seth.
I think I'm going to follow Rachel's precedent on this and also give a yes and no answer. I'd say we're better off today because a year ago, it was not clear that it was over. Trump had organized a coup attempt. He still had 2 weeks left in the White House. He still had Twitter. He still had Facebook. And no one in the White House appeared willing to take the legal and constitutional steps to remove him. It was not at all clear that that was over at that time. We're worse off today because I think, Fritz, as you were pointing out earlier, the events of that day at the time were broadly viewed as terrible across party lines. And that's simply not true today. Today, it's much more perceived through a partisan lens, which I think is a lot more dangerous.
Thanks, Seth. And Susan.
In a very limited way, we're better off, not ignoring anything that's been said in the last few minutes, but we've had a year to place this event in a much wider context and to see not just the fragility of our civic institutions, but the way in which this use of political violence has a much larger history behind it.
Well, by my count, we're evenly balanced on the question, one on each side and 3 split votes. I don't know, Naz, you or I, we'll have a chance perhaps to weigh in later on this, but maybe, so a great set. You've actually already raised many of the dimensions of the conversation I think we'll want to have. So terrific. And let me turn back to you, Naz, to begin to hone in on some of the specific questions that we want to ask of our panel.
Thanks, Fritz. And I think that split count just about represents the state of American democracy. So, we're starting off on a good foot.
For the
Susan,
record, we didn't plan that. So that was very good.
Susan, I'm going to pass the first question to you. Is there a precedent in American history for the type of political violence that we saw on January 6th last year at the insurrection? And are there elements of the insurrection and its consequences that, given the historical context, appear especially disturbing to you in that relief?
Let me start with the first part. For all the reasons that Dean Mayer pointed out, the event of last January was absolutely unprecedented. It was the only time in American history when a peaceful transition of power was actually threatened, with the colossal and very different exception of the 7 Gulf states that refused to accept the election of Abraham Lincoln and left rather than to accede to that outcome. It's the only time we've seen such a threat at the national level. It is also one of the only attempts we've ever seen to reverse the outcome of a presidential election by disrupting the process. In other words, the insurrectionary nature of what happened is unique, and I will completely allow that. The ongoing investigation that Rachel Epstein referenced suggests that the coordination is truly disturbing and something that has been paired with absolutely legal maneuvering at the state level. So for all of those reasons, there are absolutely grounds for us to be shocked and outraged and to see this as unprecedented. But for those of you who know me know there's a big but or however here, and that is that the three elements that made this unique, the fact that it was on the national stage, the fact that it was insurrectionary, and the fact that it created instability, those have all blinded us to the ways that I think are much more important, that this is part of a much longer and very rich and ubiquitous history of political violence in this country. And I want to talk about that. This country has a long tradition of resorting to the use of force to shape political outcomes. Since its inception, we have seen individuals, parties, and state actors use both the law and violence to control access to the vote. Of course, that's been an issue of tremendous consternation and controversy over the last 200 years or so. Almost always, this practice of limiting the vote has been carried out in the name of preserving democracy, and we see that today. Ending corruption, restoring integrity to the electoral process, wiping out fraud. All of those have been the kinds of things that we've seen in the last few years that have justified not just the use of force and the intimidation of poll workers, but also the increasingly radical moves that are happening at the state level in legislatures that I hope some of my colleagues can speak to. In the 1850s, an actual political party, the Know Nothing Party, founded itself on the conviction that the Irish and Catholic immigrants of recent years were so easily corrupted that they were illegitimate voters, and thus force was justified to prevent them from accessing the polls. Even more widespread and sustained and consequential is the use of force that we saw after Reconstruction to intimidate and remove African Americans from the ballot box. Now, that violence was so widespread that it was one of the reasons that the Grant administration and the Congress created the Department of Justice to begin to protect the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And the Grant administration, through the Department of Justice, started to wipe out the intimidation of groups like the Klan and the White League temporarily. But the fact is that that political force laid the groundwork for the much more powerful and legal and constitutional efforts to remove Blacks from the ballot box across the American South. And I just want to remind people that those constitutional means, first in the Mississippi Plan of 1890 and then metastasizing across the South, those created a one-party rule in the South for nearly 7 decades. In other words, when we look back and pretend that there is a kind of tradition of civic ideal functioning in this country, we're using very, very selective lenses. And that's the part that most disturbs me. I want to conclude by saying that the reason that the Capitol attack seems so unprecedented is for those individual reasons, the fact that it was insurrectionary, the fact that it was deployed against the state. And then finally, the fact that it created instability. The greatest irony I want to leave all of you with here is that the vast history of political violence in this country has not led to political instability. And that's because it has been wielded by groups that most often already have established power against those who have less power or who are vulnerable. And for that reason, when we see something like the event at the Capitol, it creates a kind of collective amnesia, and we're right to be shocked. But at the same time, if we look closely, we will see that political violence is ubiquitous and is most powerfully paired with perfectly legal and constitutional means to disfranchise voters. Thanks, Naz.
Let me ask for a follow-up with Seth, and maybe not such a long sweep of history, but also in the sense of the context in which the insurrection didn't just come, it came out of nowhere, given the state of U.S. Party politics. And so get you to reflect on how the American political system learned from, absorbed, reacted to the events of January 6th, And also, should we have foreseen the radicalization of the Republican Party along these lines? And how has the Democratic Party responded or performed in response?
Thanks for that. There's a lot in that question. So I actually want to return to a little bit what I was mentioning in our short answer section a little bit ago, and just to reiterate that the American political system was pretty close to unified against the violence on January 6th last year.
Yeah.
Even a lot of Republican office holders who had been very loyal to Donald Trump up until that point were calling him out for his role in that. And I want to just run just a few quotes here. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said, I'm quoting here, "The violence, destruction, and chaos we saw earlier was unacceptable, undemocratic, and un-American. The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attacks on Congress by mob rioters." Minority Whip Steve Scalise said, "Once you start taking violent actions against law enforcement, you're not a protester anymore, you're an anarchist." Congressman Mike Gallagher said, "Mr. President, you have got to stop this. You're the only person who can call this off. This election is over. This is bigger than you. It is bigger than any member of Congress. It is about the United States of America." Any of those quotes could have come from Joe Biden yesterday. There was really sort of broad agreement on both the enormity of the problem and of then President Trump's role in organizing and perpetrating it. And then really over the following weeks after that, the worst thing that could have happened happened. Just like with COVID, something that shouldn't be partisan, that didn't have to be partisan, became partisan. As we've mentioned, most Republican voters now embrace this big lie that Biden wasn't legitimately elected, in large part because they've been encouraged to hold those positions by Republican office holders, by conservative media figures. Many of those leaders now rationalize or even defend the insurrectionists as some sort of heroes or political prisoners. They're leading Republican voters to reject elections that they don't win, and really to pivot away from democracy. It was really telling, Fritz, as you pointed out, that there was that moment yesterday when Speaker Pelosi convened the House for a moment to honor the fallen police officers, and she was joined by all the Democrats and just 2 Republicans, Liz Cheney and her father, who hasn't held office since 2009. It's a dangerous situation. It's a difficult one to get out of just because of the pernicious nature of the partisanship involved. In terms of sort of what led up to this, as I'm sure Susan Schulten would agree, there's long been kind of an anti-democratic strain in American politics. That certainly defined the American South, for example, for a lot of American political history. And it wasn't necessarily associated with the Republican Party for a long time. But today's Republicans have moved increasingly in that direction. The nomination of Donald Trump in 2016 really wasn't completely out of the blue, but his utter rejection of democratic norms, of secure elections, really was a big leap for many Republicans, and quite a few of them took it. In terms of, you had asked about the Democratic Party, I would say for the most part, Democrats are taking this seriously. And I think just within the last few months, quite a few more are taking it seriously than were. There are some reforms they could be passing at the state and federal level that they have not so far. So the bulk of Senate Democrats, for example, would probably pass some reforms to make it, say, harder for a losing party to do what Donald Trump tried to do in 2020. I know there's still negotiations going on along these lines. A handful of some of these moderate Democrats, particularly Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and a few others, I think are generally supportive of this, but are not willing to take extraordinary measures to do this, which might include reforming or even eliminating the Senate filibuster. They seem to value some Senate traditions more than they're worried about the loss of American democracy here. As Rachel was pointing out, Trump and there is a very large criminal investigation going on right now related to January the 6th. Trump and some of the organizers of that insurrection could be prosecuted for incitement or some other charge, I would imagine, but so far that doesn't seem to be happening. So that's something we simply have to wait and see on. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. I'm going to turn to Alan now, and just to pick up on one of the themes in particular that Susan was emphasizing, that we've seen in in American political history, these spurts of political violence that are then followed by slower and potentially more corrosive legal and constitutional action. Alan, as we know today, a great deal of partisan political action is being pursued in the legal and constitutional arena. So could you lay out for us what the legal landscape looks like in the aftermath of the insurrection? And in particular, is there a threat to American democracy from state legislatures? And finally, sorry for layering on the questions, how might we expect a Supreme Court now dominated by conservative justices to eventually become involved?
Thanks, Naz. So this is where I start to temper my mild optimism from earlier. And what I wanted to talk about today is I think it's a mistake to view the insurrection in isolation. So rather, we should be looking at it in the way it is, intersected with what look like ordinary legal and political mechanisms that have both legitimized, I think, in some sense, the insurrection, and then have been being legitimized by it. So what I mean by that, things that have enabled the insurrection are, by December 12th of 2020, there had been 86 lawsuits filed to challenge the election results in the United States in federal and state court. None of those suits succeeded. But the fact that they were out there, they were being reported in the news, to some extent, I think, lends some credibility to the idea. Well, if all these lawyers are filing all these lawsuits, there must be something to this to the big lie. But because that's not just something I read on Twitter. This is, it takes something to file a federal lawsuit or a state lawsuit. Even though all 86 of them were dismissed, many of them by Republican-appointed federal judges, many of them by judges appointed by Donald Trump, which is one of the silver linings, I think, of the third branch of government having a role here. But on the other hand, as I said, I think it would be not surprising to see that some of the people involved in the insurrection look to those as sort of a reason for them to take action. And then on the other side of it, since January 6th, we've seen all sorts of action at the state level to respond to the big lie, right? So what we've seen are efforts to primary and successful efforts to primary Republican secretaries of state who certified the election results in an accurate manner or who refused to alter the outcome of the vote tallies in their states. According to the Brennan Center, as of about a month ago, lawmakers in 19 states have enacted 34 measures to restrict the ability to vote in those states. Again, I think that to some extent, those measures are being are legitimized by the idea that there was concern about the legitimacy of the election. In Arizona, there's a bill. This is maybe one of the most dangerous things. The Arizona legislature has introduced 3 bills to take away from the Secretary of State the role of certifying the electoral college, the electors for the state of Arizona, and restoring that, sort of reverting it back to the state legislature, which under the U.S. Constitution is permissible. The state legislatures are in charge under the U.S. Constitution for certifying the electors from each state. So if you think about January 6th not in isolation, but as sort of creating this momentum, this political momentum for these legal and political moves to restrict voting, they may not need a violent insurrection next time, right? They'll have the legal mechanisms to have people in place. And because of the heavy partisanship that Professor Maskins has been talking about, we may actually see into the 2024 presidential election, highly partisan state officials ignoring the popular vote. It seems like something that couldn't happen here, or it shouldn't. It should be something that couldn't happen here, but I'm not so sure that it won't, at least in some states. And then to the last question, can we rely on the Supreme Court of the United States to protect us? I wish that were the case. I think in past years of my life, I would have believed that it could. But this particular Supreme Court, not just because of the 3 Trump appointees representing a third of the existing court, has shown itself to be an incredibly anti-democratic court, going all the way back to the Citizens United decision, that sort of disabled Congress's ability to restrict campaign spending. The Russo versus Common Cause decision, where the Supreme Court said federal courts have no business in reviewing partisan gerrymandering. The Shelby versus Holder, Shelby County versus Holder decision, and the Brnovich decisions, basically gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, everything that they've done in recent years that relates to the right to vote and to our protecting our democracy, our democratic institutions, has gone the wrong way, in my opinion. And so, so there goes all my optimism from 10 minutes ago.
In the category of optimistic things, let me turn to Debbie. A couple of weeks ago, 3 retired senior U.S. military officials warned in the Washington Post that we should prepare now for a 2024 insurrection in which there could conceivably be split loyalties in the military ranks, with service members following orders from competing commanders-in-chief or not following the chain of command. Wow. How should we think about this? What do we know about the involvement of military personnel in the insurrection, the military's response on that day, but I guess more generally, this alarm that's been raised by these senior military officers?
Yeah, that was a sobering one. This was by Generals Eaton, Taguba, and Anderson. And they made clear that a number of the people who participated in the insurrection were either current or former military. And I think it's like 81 of the over 700 people that have been indicted are people with military backgrounds, which is sobering. What's really interesting about that article is that what they don't talk about, which is, what's come to be known as a sort of interesting part of the January 6th story is the efforts of General Milley, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, and others, to blunt what they saw to be a real threat that Trump would invoke the Insurrection Act and use the military in order to hang on to power. Now, this plan was actually widely reported in December, late December of 2020. It was allegedly hatched with the advice of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. And according to Christopher Miller, this was one of the reasons for the delay in sending National Guard troops to the Capitol. The worry was that if National Guard troops were there, Trump might be able to use them to sort of rescue the republic from a manufactured crisis. So you really had on that day, the military sort of participating already on both sides of the insurrection. Now, since that time, like Helen said, we have a different administration in power. There's been a much more kind of sober approach to sort of thinking about how to deal with the military in this situation. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who of course got a special dispensation to become Secretary of Defense, given his close proximity of his military retirement, but he has a lot of military and he has taken a number of steps, including a stand down in March. He created a working group. He funded a RAND study, and they just issued a report in late December clarifying Pentagon policies on extremist activity and suggesting that the Pentagon recognize the scope of the problem, take a number of steps to detect and intervene to prevent extremism in the ranks. So there's quite a lot that's happening, I would say, on the administration side to try to think about this and to use a great deal of research on how we think about extremism more generally in a kind of sophisticated way to deal with it in the military. On the other hand, and this also comes up in the op-ed that you referenced, Fritz, over 100 retired flag officers have issued a statement supporting the former president's big lie. And there have been notable individual incidents of resistance, particularly to President Biden's vaccine mandate. So it's interesting. I mean, the big problem is that it's better to have the military work to support democracy than to oppose it. And I actually think on balance, that's how the military's overall impact was on January 6th and in the months leading up to it. But it's really worrisome to be relying on the military as a bulwark against anti-democratic forces, both in general, that's a bad idea, all the research tells us, but also in particular in the United States. Civil military relations analysts throughout my career have worried about the politicization of the US military, and particularly its increasing ties to the Republican Party. I think that what we saw in the months after George Floyd's death, leading up to the insurrection on January 6th, was a military that was really beginning to push back against an extraordinary level of politicization by President Trump. So essentially his efforts to cloak himself in the military, to famously walk across Lafayette Square with General Milley in uniform, generated a level of distaste that really created a pushback. And in fact, General Milley, publicly almost apologized for his role in that incident. But this pushback is political. There's no way not to be political in this situation. And I think that the op-ed is really asking to sort of put the military back in the barracks and take it out of politics. And, I, for one, am actually grateful for the political activity that prevented, efforts to use the National Guard to, on behalf of a claim under the Insurrection Act. And so I think that it's really, really complicated to think about the role of the military right now. I think the generals make a really good point about the potential effects of politicization. It's likely to reduce effectiveness in the military, and it's likely to provoke dangers to democracy. But given the degree of conservatism in the force, support for Trump among Republican lawmakers, which has increasingly normalized extreme views, efforts by the military to manage extremism itself are unlikely to work. And so, maybe I'll leave it there. Buckle your seatbelt.
Thanks so much, Debbie, for that really nuanced answer to a difficult question. Fritz, you and I agreed that we would each get to comment on one thing, even as we're moderating. So I'm going to ask you a question that relates to your work on narrative. The proximate trigger for the insurrection, as you discussed in your opening remarks, is the big lie that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. So the question for you is, how does this big lie still persist? And given what Seth just told us about Republican elites, what Debbie just talked about in the ranks of the military as well, it grows stronger. The big lie grows stronger in the face of all evidence that it is indeed a lie. So what is it about the right-wing narratives around the 2020 presidential election and now their electoral strategy moving forward, as Alan just described for us, that make them so difficult to combat? And what should the Democrats be doing on this front?
Easy questions. Thank you, Naz. In a way, it's the way I think about it is there are really two big lies. And to understand what happened on January 6th, you need to understand both of them. The one that we're talking about is the lie that the election was stolen, and that it was, and this was a culmination of a story that's been percolating for a long time about fraud and we've been worried about this for several election cycles beforehand. The Brennan Center had been all over this, for example. But the lie that the election was stolen. But the other lie is what gives it its edge. It's not just that it was taken away from Trump, but who took it away and for what reasons. Look at the signs that save America. And this is part of this sweeping myth of that animates the right, in which the American way of life is under assault. by forces, liberal forces that are un-American, destroying the American way of life, et cetera, and that there are, that in some sense they are the enemy. And it's the intersection of those two things that really gives it an edge. I mean, you have to, what is it those people on January 6th imagined they were doing? How did they imagine? What did they think they were doing? They thought they were heroes. In fact, that's the story now that's being picked up elsewhere too, right? So they thought they were saving the republic. And interestingly, a higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats think answer the question that democracy is in peril. There's a nice piece by David Graham in the Atlantic on this this week. They think the democracy is in peril, America's in peril, and they think they're acting to save it. Right. So first of all, it's both of those stories. Now the question is why is this believed? I mean, neither is true. Just be clear. Why is it believed? And the starting point is perhaps to be a little bit humble, which is to recognize that all of us, to some extent or another, our views of politics are constructed by the stories we hear and believe. We are, whatever else we are, storytelling animals. Now we're an unusual group here in that we spend a lot of time, thinking, analyzing, perhaps testing our own narratives against a set of facts, really worrying about it. But most people don't, and it's rational not to do that. It's really, there's nothing in it for people to really examine it. And so, not that all stories are equally true, they're not, but all of us in some sense construct our understandings of politics. So one answer to this is that we are, as human beings, remarkably susceptible to stories that, two things. One, the stories that we hear, and the stories that resonate or justify certain other stories that we already have in mind. So let me take those two things. In the last 20 years or so, there's been an absolute transformation in the information ecosystem, in the media environment. Social media. I mean, it began with the cable news, and so Fox, MSNBC, and the fracturing of the network monopolies, and these niche markets. Talk radio on the right, huge for years and years. And then, of course, now the social media environment. And what that's enabled is distinct markets for information, distinct media information universes, echo chambers, et cetera. And there's an industry out there that makes money by perpetuating these myths. And right, this Tucker Carlson is doing the right thing for Fox. He's got great ratings, right? This sells. We know Facebook. Algorithm rewards, gave greater weight for outrage reactions, right? They figured out the machine itself, they didn't even require anyone to think about it. The machine itself fed people stories that reinforced their initial biases of one kind or another. So a second answer to this is that we are vulnerable to the stories we hear through, from elected officials, from media that are whispered to us by our neighbors. We run in circles increasingly that tell the same stories, and so that's been a big factor. And the last thing I would say is about the power of stories is the stories that stick and that are the ones that resonate with prior stories in a way, but also with this kind of set of resentments, economic, racial, gender, religious, that are out there, and so what you get is this kind of poisonous intersection, I think, of political leaders, a media industry that is all too willing to exploit the human vulnerability, our appetite for the simple story, to make sense of the world, and to exploit those stories that unfortunately do resonate with people's anxieties about, yes, the economy, but also race, power, and to some extent backlash around gender, political correctness. You know, there's a whole set of things that that are always latent in a society. They've been there. Susan would attest. I mean, these are old themes in American society. They've been there, but in this particular moment, I think we found that is the intersection of political leaders and the media environment have found a particularly adept at exploiting those underlying resentments. And so for all of those reasons, this is very potent, very difficult to break into. You know, your last question is, well, what do we do about it? And of course, that's the hardest question of all. And that, you know, in some sense, it is very difficult because you really do have these self-contained echo chambers. Now, to come back to a point Seth made, I mean, I think Biden's statement yesterday was long overdue. The president has a unique bully pulpit. He was actually covered, I think, on Fox News. It rarely gets direct coverage on Fox News. My thing about stories is you can't beat a story without another story. And if, you know, I don't think, you know, Biden in some sense and his mentor, you know, Obama were intermittently good storytellers, but they're not been so good at consistently telling that story. And so I think the Democrats have to, not just the lower level elected officials, but the president of the United States has to play an important role in this. But I don't have a simple answer to the question. I wish I did. It's a very difficult problem.
Thank you, Fritz. A complex question and a really complex set of answers, and kind of really nicely summarizing a set of themes that we've been discussing about kind of looking at ourselves from within. I want to turn to Rachel now to ask kind of a couple of final questions in terms of how people are looking at now at the United States from the outside. And Rachel, you kind of referenced this in your answer to the first question that Fritz kicked us off with. How are other parts of the world viewing, how did they view the insurrection at the US Capitol to begin with, and how now are other countries, other leaders across the world assessing the state of American democracy in the aftermath of the insurrection? And to kind of flip it around, is the radical right here in the United States, the radical right wing, learning from elected autocrats around the world, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, to reference Tucker Carlson again, and gaining from affiliation with them?
Thanks, Naz. And I really appreciate the whole panel. It's very interesting for me to listen to everybody's perspective. I will just start with a casual observation from a Chinese citizen that I read earlier this week, which is, you know, sitting in China, why would we ever want democracy? The Americans have elected as president the worst person in the world. And, you know, reading that, I have a really hard time defending American democracy in a process where somebody like that can reach the highest office. Then turning more specifically to Europe, which is where my area of expertise is the strongest. I've been in touch with a number of friends and colleagues in the UK, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Germany over the last week, trying to get a sense of how the anniversary has played out in those countries and what people's reactions are. And, you know, it's a range, and at least one friend of mine seems to be taking it in stride. But honestly, most other people are deeply, deeply concerned. And for one colleague who originally comes from Hungary, which is a case I'll talk about in more detail in response to your question in a minute, you know, her reaction was, it was so shocking to see those images. She compared it to 9/11 in terms of what she perceived to be the destabilizing impact of those events. She also said, and this is a quote, it shook the basis of our perception of American democracy. And by that, I think she meant that for all the flaws that Susan talked about in American democracy historically, for many people, and I think especially for Europeans in the post-war period, that has not been the image that the United States projected, particularly in Europe, keeping in mind how problematic American democracy has been at home, but also how problematic US conduct has traditionally been vis-a-vis democratic governance elsewhere in the world. Nevertheless, for people sitting in Europe, it looked like a very new and shocking development. I think speaking to some of the then specific effects that you're referencing, Naz, with respect to Hungary, and do right-wing leaders, authoritarian leaders, do they learn from each other? Yes. So Viktor Orban is the prime minister in Hungary. He's been in power there Since 2010, he's very autocratic in his methods of governing. But getting back to something that Alan said, in a way, I feel like the United States might be learning from Hungary, in the sense that the autocratization that's been underway now for more than a decade in Hungary has, in a profound sense, been legally undertaken, right? So when Alan says, we could see a legal seizure in a way, and a politicization on a legal basis of our voting process, that's long been underway in Hungary for many years, actually, before Trump came to power. In terms of the specific effect of January 6th in a country like Hungary, Orban and Trump are very close allies. You might have noticed that Trump just endorsed Orban's re-election campaign for this year coming up. But also Orban used the insurrection on January 6th to also cast doubt on the veracity of Biden's win. Okay, so that's a very narrow case in which we can see some pretty direct effects, and I think some pretty close coordination between the right-wing leaders, Naz, that you were talking about. I think in Europe more broadly, and what I heard from a number of people spanning from the UK all the way over to Romania, is that there's an effort to build and stitch together, indeed, an international network of nationalist, chauvinistic, illiberal political movements. And specifically, one colleague from Romania told me that she thought the activities of people like Mike Pence, Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, particularly in Eastern Europe, advancing this sort of illiberal, traditional values, nationalistic agenda, in a way means that US internal divisions are increasingly reflected in Europe, because right-wing forces from the United States are actively cultivating those divisions. And moreover, and this is particularly sensitive for democratically minded people in Eastern Europe, it is exactly the agenda that Russia and Putin are themselves trying to carry out, right? It's a strategy of dividing and conquering. And so in a very paradoxical way, a leading US official in the form of Mike Pence is doing Putin's work for him. So you can summarize the reaction internationally, I think, as a combination of concern and glee, and none of it is good for the United States or for the US role in the world or for democracy globally.
Thanks, Rachel. And continuing with the international focus, a question for you, Naz. The Biden administration came in with a kind of back to the future effort to recommit to global liberalism. One piece of which was this recent democracy summit, where they trying to bring like-minded countries together to resist and rescue and resuscitate global democracy. I guess the question is how do these events, January 6th and all the other things we're talking about, and the state of things that here in the US affect those foreign policy goals and the ability of the Biden administration to really lead that effort?
Thank you, Fritz. And my sort of answer to those questions will really follow kind of directly along from what Rachel just kind of laid out for us. My sense is that the insurrection, and more importantly, its aftermath in all the ways that we've been discussing today, have really undermined the Biden administration's ability to pursue its foreign policy agenda. As Rachel just laid out so clearly, the insurrection has had direct and specific impacts overseas, and the lasting consequences signal a decline in the credibility and influence of the US abroad. And I would just lay out kind of three effects really quickly. First, as you just said, Fritz, the Biden administration came into office pledging to restore America's commitment to global liberalism, after Trump's 4 years in office had really eroded very badly the US's ability to sort of wear that mantle. Secretary of State Tony Blinken declared in his confirmation hearing that the US was ready to once again be the leading force for good in the world. The next day, President Biden said in his inauguration speech, "America has been tested and we've come out stronger for it. We'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example." And those words are just much easier to believe on January 20th last year than they are today. given that we've really not been able to do all that much to burnish our example on the democratic front. The opposite has happened, as Rachel just laid out. US democracy has been downgraded by international ratings like Freedom House and International IDEA, so that our democratic peers are now countries like Argentina and Mongolia, which are democracies, but we used to sit atop the rankings with countries like Germany, France, and Britain. And so, that comes in the context of the broader crisis of liberal democracy around the world, where democracy has been in retreat for 15 straight years. So my sort of first conclusion is that it's hard to believe that anybody really sees the US at the vanguard of the global democracy movement anymore, if anybody ever did. And it's nothing short of alarming that one party in our two-party system, as Seth laid out so clearly, has chosen to align itself with the big lie and diminishing the threat to democracy evidenced in the insurrection. The second thing I would sort of point to is that the Biden administration, and you can see this in its interim national security strategy, is quite clear that the primary threat to the security of the US comes from China and Russia, right? Our illiberal authoritarian peer competitors. It even casts the contest for global order as one between open and closed systems, and commits the US to a defense of openness, of freedom on countless dimensions: free trade, free shipping, free standards. And it puts democracy, American democracy and global democracy, at the heart of that contest, and calls on the US to lead by the power of our example. So our ability to mount a concerted, sort of focused defense of an open liberal order in the face of constant Chinese and Russian efforts, as Rachel was just describing, to poke holes in it, also rely on stable and, at least to some extent, on these foreign policy issues, unified American perspectives. But the reality is that perspectives on foreign policy challenges, for example, the percentage of Democrats and Republicans that view China or Russia as the US's primary threat have become increasingly divided along partisan lines, as have perspectives on domestic issues. And the third thing I'll point to is that some of the most pressing global challenges cannot be addressed by the United States alone, right? So the obvious one being the existential climate threat, global economic inequality as another example. To make progress on these major transnational issues, which I'll just note, these are the kinds of topics that the Korbel School has really placed front and center in our research and curricula, these things require by their nature multilateral cooperation. And here too, the US is less well placed to lead, in my opinion. When Biden came into office a year ago, there were heightened expectations for the prospects of multilateral cooperation. And the other side of that coin now is that these multilateral attempts have really proven a challenge for the Biden administration, even an outright disappointment in the eyes of some of our allies. To find a point on it, how credible can it be for the US to sign an international treaty when, to be ratified into law, it has to be passed through a 50-50 Senate in the current context of American democracy? So I know I've sketched a very dismal landscape there. It pains me to do so. And I think it's worth saying that we've been discussing these things analytically. They're emotional for all of us as well, and I'm sure for members of our audience. We're a house divided, and those effects travel abroad as much as they affect us here at home. But I guess I'll try to end with a glimmer of hope that lies in us not trying to stand apart from this global democratic context. As a number of people have emphasized, a number of people who are now going into the Biden administration, finally their nominations or they're being confirmed in important foreign policy positions. The genuine attempt to share our struggle at home, our democratic struggle, and our effort to kind of restore and strengthen democracy at home could in the end make us an even more effective and credible partner in the global push to turn back the tide of democratic erosion. So I'll end on that slightly optimistic note and turn it back to you, Fritz.
Well, thank you, Naz. And if our story ends well, then we will once again have some force in the world. Well, this is extraordinary, right? As we're echoing what Rachel said, it's been a great pleasure to listen to all of you. I've learned a lot from this wonderfully rich conversation. We're going to turn now to the audience, but before we do, I'm going to do a very quick round robin. And in the interest of time, so we do get to think, I'm just going to ask you a very quick response on a scale of 1 to 10. How alarmed are you about the threat to democracy in the United States? And I'm going reverse order that I began with. So I'll go Susan.
Oh, I hate 1 to 10. I am fairly alarmed, even as I see a long history here. But I want to turn that around in the way that Naz just did as well. The greatest concern for me is that our students have not seen in their lifetime even the illusion, as Rachel called it. And she's right. There's an extraordinary level of confidence in American democracy for much of the 20th century. Since 9/11, we have seen the erosion of that. My greatest concern is that our students have not seen that as an example in their lifetime. The opportunity here, to go back to Naz's point, is that we are an educational institution and the stakes couldn't be higher for us to teach them about the fragility of these institutions.
Yeah, amen. Seth,
Okay, so
I didn't get a number out of Susan, by
Yeah.
the way. Yeah, number, no number, not going to give me one, huh? All
put her
right.
down for a 5.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's see, somewhat complex. How scared am I for like an 1860 style civil war or a fascist dictatorship? I'd put that at around maybe a 2 or a 3. How scared am I for democratic erosion, in which a losing party overturns an election to remain in power? Political violence becomes more common. Put me down for around an 8 or a 9.
All right, Rachel.
That was way too succinct, Seth. Didn't give me enough time to figure out what I want to say. So I'm also reluctant to apply a number, but I think the thing that we haven't talked about as much as I wish is what's going on in the Republican Party and how we can help the Republican Party become a viable competitor again. I'm like on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried I am about that political party, it's a 10.
Nice, Alan.
I'm going to resist the Spinal Tap answer. I'm not going to say 11. I'm going to say 7. And the 3 points of optimism are not every one of these efforts is going to succeed at the state level. To the legislative efforts I talked about before, and but I'm worried.
Debbie.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say 7 too. So even though we started off differently, Alan, we're ending up similarly. And I would just, I would just point out in terms of sort of thinking about optimism or sort of steps forward, that, we've talked a lot about both Rachel and Naz, I thought really nicely talked about the connections between the right wing and its sort of global interlocutors. But we could talk that way about the left wing too. And I think when I see the people coming into the Biden administration, many of them have thought very deeply about democratic practices beyond like democracies and autocracies. And I would hope that we would begin to sort of move in that way to interlink with people all over the world, including in China, who have democratic inclinations. And I think that might be a more productive way forward, but I think it's going to be a rocky road.
Naz.
6 2/3.
And the correct answer is 7.2. So very, obviously it's still a silly framing in some ways to a very complex issue, but I think the general sense is, plenty of things to worry about, but certainly not hopeless. And I think all of us are at our core optimists by nature of what we do, in the sense that we think, as Susan just said, that there's a chance to work with our students, there are opportunities to engage this issue. And having once named it and thought about it, that at least is my hope, that we find a way as a polity to come together and figure this one out. Now let's turn to, so thank you all for that. Let's turn to questions. We don't have as much time as I'd hope, but we'll get to as many as we can. And I don't know, Naz, if you've been looking at the questions, maybe you want to take the first one.
Sure, I'll take the first cut. And just as I tee the questions up, I wanted to say one thing earlier, which I didn't get to say, which is that what happened the day before January 6th was the elections of Senator John Ossoff and Senator Raphael Warnock in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, on the wave of a movement led by Black women voters in particular. And so just speaking to Debbie's point that there are kind of things that we haven't looked at in our conversation here that are sources of hope as well, I think is important to look look at. So thank you to the audience for terrific engagement and for sticking with us through a difficult conversation. We've got a number of questions here. We're going to try and get through as many as we can. And for each one, I'm going to try and just pass it to a couple or one or two of our panelists who are kind of most, the questions are most in their wheelhouse. So I'm going to start with Alan and Susan, and I'll go to Alan first and then Susan on the first question, which is about the Constitution. And this is from Randy Bloomfield. Thank you. Randy says, it seems the founders of the American Republic created a political system of representative democracy, i.e. the Electoral College, that could not envision or anticipate the evolution of political parties today. To what extent is the sort of state of party politics in the United States, or to what extent should parties in some sense go away in order to avoid future insurrections and otherwise eliminate political gridlock and ineffectiveness? And so this is really a question about constitutionally, what is the role, how have parties kind of played into the impasse that we're at now? Maybe in the past, have there been examples where different parties have, evolution in the party system has kind of addressed some of the things that we've talked about today. So Alan, to you first, please.
Well, just quickly, there's nothing constitutionally requiring the United States to have a two-party system. However, the fact that we have a presidential rather than a parliamentary system makes it more difficult, I think, to migrate to a system like that. I mean, there's been noise recently about, the moderate and liberal Republicans breaking off and starting a third party. I'm not sure. So there's no constitutional barrier. This is probably actually a better question for Seth. But I don't see it happening because of the way that the parties are so entrenched right now in our electoral system.
Susan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the question, I appreciate the question, and it's certainly a question that I remember having as a 17-year-old, thinking parties are the problem. And I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but this is one could say the exact opposite, that the parties are really the symptoms, right? That rather than that the rage or the reaction, whatever you want to say, is much deeper than the organization of a party. I just have to laugh because for much of the mid 20th century, the joke was that there was so little differentiating the parties that it was hard to tell the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. And the American Political Science Association actually pleaded with them to make their ideological differences more palpable. So I guess I see that as a little bit of a misreading of where the problem is coming from, although I appreciate the line between ideology and partisanship that has brought us to where we are. But like Alan, I'd kind of like to kick that one to Seth.
Over to you, Seth, by popular demand.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that there are quite a few political scientists engaged in a conversation about this right now. A lot of American political scientists who are starting to see, who have, including people like me, who have long defended the two-party system, now see it as potentially problematic, as having become in many ways too polarized to function well. To certainly to function well within the way American political institutions have been developed. The question is, what do you do about them? And that's honestly pretty tricky. You might have to change a number of the ways that elections are actually run in this country. We have a presidential system, as Alan pointed out. We have what are called first past the post election. That is, whoever gets the most votes in a congressional district wins the whole district. All those are kind of, tend to be systems that produce two-party systems. There are a number of states and local areas that are attempting different kinds of reforms along these lines, trying with ranked choice voting. A few places are, trying to find ways to work toward more proportional style voting, where you'd have, say, a party that gets 40% of the vote gets 40% of the seats in the state house or in the legislature, or anything like that. Some of those reforms could come about without constitutional amendments. It's possible to do that. And if you do that, you can theoretically get a situation where there's 3 or 4 or 5 parties. And in that way, if that happens, you possibly get a situation where there's less polarization, or where the consequences of one party doing well are not as dire as they are in our current system. Political scientist Lee Drutman, who's at the New America Foundation, he put out a book on this last year. He and a few others have been working in this area. So I know, we know there's a number of states and cities that are working on reforms along these lines, but I'm not terribly optimistic about how many current office holders who've done well under the current system are going to be that embracing of reforms in this direction.
Great, thanks to all of you for those thoughtful answers. Let me turn to a question for Rachel, actually. To what extent do you see the advent of Trump, like the rise of Brexit and Johnson in the UK, as a distinctive artifact of late-stage neoliberalism, which has failed to deliver investment growth and inclusive prosperity as originally promised? Do you see that as part of a global phenomenon which populists rise and are sustained as the last way to avoid a major paradigm shift in the global political economy?
So I know the person who wrote that question, that's Abby Innes, my friend at the LSE, who I know has her own answer to this question. I have a slightly different answer from Abby, I think. So there's something structural in the global economy going on because democratic backsliding, it's not just a US phenomenon. Certainly the UK is affected, the Philippines, India, Brazil, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, right? There's a long list. And that makes me suspicious that in this moment, there's something broad structural happening, and it's more than just Mike Pence going to Hungary. But I think it might have more to do with the structural change in the economy, which was China's opening up and the Soviet collapse, and the ways in which that huge introduction of new labor changed working conditions in at least some advanced industrialized economies and contributed, according to Branko Milanovic, to wage stagnation in the industrialized economies. So I don't know how much it's the economically dispossessed who are driving these populist movements across the globe, but that's something to be researched. And if we find that, I think we could find some sources of the problem in the way we've structured the global economy, hyper-liberal policies being part of that formula. Yes.
Thanks, Rachel. Naj, you want to tee one up?
Sure, I'll tee one up for Debbie, and this kind of goes back, Debbie, to our kind of question framing of this event as being about an insurrection, and I talked about that at the outset. The question is, can you really have an insurrection without guns? A lot of guns, rounds, explosive tanks, and so on. When one group is being effectively silenced by another, the media, big tech, the government, do we have existential issues? And is the sort of more important question what led certain groups to take these actions in the first place?
Yeah, so I once wrote a book where I sort of looked at military activity like way back to the Greeks, there's a lot of different ways to hurt people, and so I think you can't have insurrection without guns, and we saw that. We saw people being beaten with tire irons and things like that at the insurrection, but that does also open the one thing I didn't talk about is the degree to which many of the organizers were not military members, but were members of militia groups, and they have a lot of guns. And so the explosion of guns in the United States has been extraordinary. Over the last 10 years, there are small arsenals that are held by a very, very small fraction of the American public. And many of them are associated with militia groups, which are growing by leaps and bounds. There's actually a tremendous amount of very good research on that right now. And so I think there's no shortage of guns, but you don't need them.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time, and I apologize to those of you who put questions in the Q&A. Hopefully, we touched on at least some of the topics of interest to you. And let me just thank all of you in the audience for being with us this afternoon on a Friday afternoon. It is a measure of level of interest and concern, I suppose, all of us feel about the state of affairs that you've done. So thank you so much to my colleagues. I've really enjoyed listening to you, and thanks for taking the time to to share your thoughts on these topics. A bit of an advertisement for those of you who are interested, in those of you in the audience in these topics. We will have opportunity to explore many of them, at least in somewhat more depth, at the upcoming Denver Democracy Summit, our second such summit. Some of you came to our first Democracy Summit last year. That will be February 10 and 11. There'll be a lot of information coming out about that shortly. But an opportunity to explore with quite a number of experts from around the world some of these topics. So look forward to seeing some of you there. Again, thank you all for being with us. I think we ended on a split boat. Anxiety about where we're at, but hopefulness and optimism and enough to keep us going. We work ahead and look forward to working with all of you as we work on these issues. Thank you for being with us.